Wow, it's amazing to be back in the Great Hall, and I'm trying to check that everyone's smiling through their eyes. So that was my mission for this evening. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here and talking about right action. So in this series of talks, we're working our way through the Noble Eightfold Path. And last week, Bodhisattva kicked us off talking about right action. And the action, of course, is important because it's how our vision manifests in the world. He was describing that to us last week. And he talked really beautifully about how we can navigate the law of karma to experience positive or negative mental states, depending on whether we act skillfully or unskillfully. And that determines whether we live in a positive world or in a negative world. And at the end of that talk, he evoked the Pure Land, which is the beautiful world that we can inhabit. The fruits of the skillful actions that we've accumulated. And we can live in that world, we can enjoy that pleasure, and our enlightenment will be guaranteed. But the world that we experience as the fruit of our actions is not the end of the story by any means. And the law of karma is about as much about the effect that we're having on the world as it is about how the world that we're living in ourselves. And I think this can be beautifully illustrated by the image of incense. So incense is a traditional image, a traditional offering in Buddhism. And when I used to work for Still Learning, the education service, we would always waft some incense around in practically every visit that we could, because it's such an excellent symbol for karma. So we light the incense and we create this beautiful environment around ourselves. So we have a lovely smell, we live in a much nicer environment suddenly than we did before. But of course, because of the way that perfume works, it doesn't just affect us, it travels out and it affects and influences all of the people who happen to come into contact with that perfume. We don't have a little perfume bubble. We have the perfume, just it can't be contained. It spreads out into the world, permeates and creates the worlds that other people live in. And it's exactly the same in action. And it's funny to think that action is the same because it looks like we're boundary, whereas perfume's not boundary, but it is the same. It's exactly the same, the way that we act, not just in our body, but also in our actions of speech and our mind. They all permeate out from us and influence and create the world that other people have to inhabit as well. And lovely if that's a nice, beautiful smell, but sometimes we do smells that aren't so nice, and that is a problem of the perfume variety and the action variety. So that becomes a problem for people, and that is not creating a pure land, which is probably what we want. I think the image of perfuming the world is really a good image for ethics and karma and acting skillfully. And of course, we're lucky enough to have a perfumed being here in the hall. It's Maitri Vasin. So his name actually means he who is perfumed by Maitri, metta. And he really is. He actually really lives out his name. And it's not magically, it's because of his skillful actions of body, speech and mind. And I know him a little. And he's a very ethical man, makes a lot of effort with his ethics. He's extremely kind and generous in his behaviour, with his time, his energy, and his possessions. His speech is positive, supportive, and beautiful, often rejoicing in other people. I very rarely hear, I don't think I've ever heard a harsh word from Maitri Vasin, actually. And I know he works hard on his mind to work against negative mental states that he experiences and to cultivate positive ones. And as a result, he has an aura of metta, of Maitri, which spreads out and permeates the world that he inhabits. And anybody who's come into contact with him will know that you leave that contact feeling uplifted, cared for, and positive as a result. And the rest of us might not have such a smelly name, but that doesn't mean that we can't also have that aspiration. We can also, imagine ourselves going around the world, speaking, thinking and behaving in such a way as to create a beautiful, lovely smell that makes everyone feel happy and positive and connected. And so in that way, we change our mindset. So we are practicing in order to make merit and gain enlightenment, not just for ourselves, which doesn't make sense in that smelling sort of analogy, but for everybody, for the world we all live in, for all all beings, so that all beings may participate and live in the Pure Land that we create. And of course, there is a name for that attitude of practice, and that name is the Bodhisattva Ideal. So that's what I'm going to talk on for the rest of this evening. So Bodhisattva means enlightenment being, and we're used to these archetypal bodhisattvas who are enlightened beings who we look up to, we revere and worship them. But Bodhisattva can also mean a being who isn't yet enlightened but strives for enlightenment for the sake of all beings, not for themselves. They're completely committed to the enlightenment of all beings. And so living by the Bodhisattva ideal would mean to live and practice in this way for everyone's benefit, for everyone's liberation. Although we don't find the term Bodhisattva ideal spoken by the Buddha, there are so many examples from his life and teachings of how very, very central and crucial and important the attitude of compassion and other regarding altruism is in the Pali Canon. How important the compassionate dimension of practice. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. So one example is following his enlightenment. So you might not know that following his enlightenment, the Buddha was initially inclined not to teach the Dharma, because he said it would be troublesome and wearisome for me, because he realized it would be extremely difficult to communicate what he had insight into, because we were all just a bit mad. He just thought they're not going to get it. So initially he thought, well, I won't do it. But then he famously looked out across the world and saw all beings as lotuses growing up from a pond, all growing towards the light. Some of them really stuck in the mud, but some of them, really kind of close to the surface, and all of them with the potential to become unfolded flowers. So when he saw this, and he saw that humans were just like this, all beings had that potential, however, deluded we might be, that there was this potential. And when he saw that, the suffering and the potential, it said he trembled with compassion for living beings. And from that compassion, he decided to spend the rest of his life teaching the Dharma, the whole of the rest of his life, right up to his very, very last utterance. And he even put off his own parinirvana, his own death, even though he was suffering, because he wanted to be sure that nobody was unclear, that nobody had any doubts. And it's staggering, really, the effect that one man had on all those people he met, all the people throughout the centuries, and us here in Sheffield 2,500 years later, all from an act of compassion. He didn't need to do that. He could have just sat under a tree and enjoyed himself, but from compassion he taught. A second example, which is my favourite example from the Pali Canon, is after very shortly, Bodhisattva knows what I'm going to talk about. Shortly after the Buddha's enlightenment, he's taught his first 5 disciples. He's met this guy called Yasa and all Yasa's friends. So there's now 61 enlightened beings in the world. And then the Buddha turns to them and he addresses them in this way. Because I am free from all shackles, whether human or divine. You too are free from all shackles, whether human or divine. Go now and wander for the welfare and happiness of many, out of compassion for the world, for the benefit, welfare and happiness of gods and humans. Teach them the Dharma that is good in the beginning, good in the middle, and good in the end, with the meaning and the letter. Explain a holy life that is utterly perfect and pure. There are beings with little dust in their eyes who will be lost through not hearing the Dharma. So I think it's very significant that this is his first big instruction to them. They're all just enlightened. And the first thing he says is, not now go and enjoy yourselves and sit under a tree, but now go and teach, because there are people who are suffering and it's important that you help them, create a beautiful world for them. Because one thing I really love about this quote is the word that he uses for good is kalyana, and kalyana also has the meaning of beautiful. Not just in an aesthetic sense, but also in a moral sense, and in a sense of something which is beautiful beyond the ordinary, coming from beyond. So I personally prefer to translate this as, teach the Dharma that is beautiful in the beginning, beautiful in the middle, and beautiful in the end. So that's what he's exhorting his disciples to do. Go and create a beautiful world, which takes us back to the incense that I was speaking about earlier. So those are just a couple of examples, but there are thousands of examples, but those are the two that sprung to mind. But the concept of the Bodhisattva ideal itself didn't come until quite a lot later with the Mahayana school, or the school of the Great Way, because the people who followed that school thought that the monastic Buddhism of the time was a little bit overemphasizing personal liberation and personal enlightenment, not sufficiently stressing the altruistic dimension of practice, which the Buddha's life and teaching and his examples made so obvious that was so important. So the Mahayana school stressed this altruistic dimension, not because they wanted to bring in something new, but because they wanted to go back to something old, to the actual spirit of the Buddhist teaching, what the Buddha had actually communicated through his example and his life. And Bhante Sangha says of the Bodhisattva ideal, if one comes into contact with the Bodhisattva ideal, then one is placing, as it were, one's hand on the very heart of Buddhism, and one is feeling, as it were, the beating of that heart. I think it's really significant that he would say that it's very, very central. It's not like an add-on. It's very, very central to the Dharma. And eventually, this wish to emphasize the altruistic dimension flowered into this very, very lofty and beautiful Bodhisattva ideal. So this ideal becomes that the Bodhisattva, a being who strives for enlightenment, even postponing their own enlightenment to make sure that other beings are enlightened, almost first, if you like, who wants to alleviate the suffering of everybody, even despite themselves. So I just think that is such a beautiful, it's such a beautiful ideal, you know, kind of somebody who is so determined that everyone should be liberated, that is their priority. And Shantideva, who wrote the guide to how to become a Bodhisattva, gives voice to this aspiration, I think, with this quote that I believe that Dalai Lama recites this every day. So as long as space abides, and so long as the world abides, so long may I abide, destroying the sufferings of the world. So yeah, really, really beautiful, like this idea you wanting to impact positively on the world really inspires me personally to practice in a way that I wouldn't bother to do, I think, if it was just all about me. So if we do find this inspiring and we want to become trainee bodhisattvas ourselves, what do we do about it? So how does this relate to us and our practice now? So one thing that Bhante Sangha says about it is we have to be careful, very careful, about interpreting it too literally. I think that is the main danger with the Bodhisattva ideal for lots of reasons. The first is that you can end up, the Bodhisattva can end up sounding like some sort of transcendental cosmic social worker with an enormous martyr complex. Like, oh, don't worry about me, you just go off and get enlightened and I'll just sit over here and suffer, and you just go off and be happy. And that is absolutely not what's going on. We don't want to get into the position of thinking Buddhism is telling us to put aside or sacrifice our own progress, or even our own happiness in that sort of way. It's important, obviously, that we attend to our own practice. If we don't, we become part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And we might not be bodhisattvas yet, perhaps you are, I'm not, but I think we probably all know from our experience that the more we do attend to our practice, the more that we do develop, the more use we are in the world, even in very small ways. So, for example, I teach piano, and I know I've become a lot more patient over the years I've been practicing, and I think my piano students benefit from that, as does my dog. So, you know, I think this is quite small, but actually that's going to have quite a big effect, you know, spreading out in the world. And I think if I was enlightened, you know, that effect would be enormously multiplied. So me putting aside my own enlightenment would make no sense. So we don't want to fall into that trap of taking it too literally and thinking we need to become that martyrdom is spiritually positive, because Buddhism does not say that. Instead, we could, instead of having that attitude, we can think of the Bodhisattva ideal, this myth, as reminding us of a very important and basic truth. Which we come across in the very first night of our introductory course, which is that we are all deeply, intimately and mysteriously connected. And the Bodhisattva, who is deeply in touch with that truth, acts on that basis. So he understands, or she or they, understands that because of this truth, one cannot be really happy if at the expense of another person. It's actually not possible. They've adopted an attitude where there is no difference between their own suffering and the suffering of another being. It's just suffering and needs to be alleviated. And prioritising one person's suffering or happiness over another's would make no sense to the Bodhisattva. So again, I'm not a Bodhisattva, but I think I have some small insight into this, and I think we all do actually. I was reminded very starkly of this truth recently. My dog is a great spiritual teacher, and recently he was whining a lot very early in the morning. I was getting really, really annoyed, and because I really wanted to be asleep and it was my day off. And he was whining, and eventually I snapped and I raised my voice, which you really shouldn't do with a greyhound, and I ushered him very abruptly out of my bedroom and closed the door quite firmly on him. And thinking, oh, well, now I'll go back to bed and have a nice sleep, which of course I couldn't do because I'd acted out of anger and I'd hurt another being, you know, not drastically, but I had inflicted suffering on another being. And of course, I couldn't be happy having done that. It's very, very much in my face that you can't be happy when you inflict suffering on another person, another being, even if it's just a dog. So I think that's a really practical and useful point we can take from the Bodhisattva Ideal, this myth. Practicing without thinking of others is a spiritual dead end. And I think that's why practices like the Metta Bhavana and ethics are so crucial. Like, we should not think of them as beginners' practices. They are, I mean, I prefer to think of them as deep insight practices, because it's these practices that will gradually erode the kind of imagined barrier that we've put up between ourselves and other people, which causes us to act in these crazy ways where we behave as if prioritising ourselves is going to cause us happiness, and then consistently discover that it won't. So if we attend to metta and ethics, that will start to help us become more and more sensitive to and sensible of the ridiculousness of that, really. And we'll become naturally more and more other regarding in the way that we operate in the world. Of course, then bringing ourselves and other people far more happiness in the process. So that's one danger we've sidestepped, becoming a martyr, but there are more dangers. So what other problems with taking the Bodhisattva Ideal too literally? So for one thing, you could think, I'm supposed to save all living beings. How on earth do I save all living beings? That's insane. Like, I'm one person. This is a ridiculous, lofty, overblown ideal. I can't possibly participate in it. I'm going to go home. So you could just get completely overwhelmed by the Bodhisattva Ideal if you take it literally. So that's one problem you could have. Another problem you could have if you take it literally is you could think, I'm a bodhisattva saving all living beings. Like you should have a mask and cape on, like you're a superhero. You could actually think you are that person. And that is problematic, because then the Bodhisattva Ideal is feeding into your ego in a really unhelpful way. So, and I've slightly, parodied those, but I must say those are definitely both, I've fallen into both of those traps myself over the years, and I'm sure that I'm not the only one. It's very easy to do. Because they're a result of taking it literally, which we do tend to do because we're quite literalistic in general. So instead of thinking in these problematic ways, Bhante has suggested that instead of thinking of ourselves as being or becoming a bodhisattva, we think of the Sangha being or becoming a bodhisattva. And he talks about the cosmic bodhisattva, which I think is extremely cool. He says, one shouldn't think in terms of, I shall become a bodhisattva, but we shall become a bodhisattva. So rather than us having to save the world, which of course we can't possibly do, we participate instead in something which is much bigger than us, which can powerfully transform the world, actually can powerfully transform the world, because there's lots of people in the Sangha. And this aspiration finds itself in the image of the 11-headed and 1,000-armed Avalokiteshvara. And I sent that, did that image make its way to? No. Well, you'll have to imagine there's a bodhisattva with 1,000 arms and 11 heads. And he's very beautiful, he's white. And he has, anyway, so imagine. He's a really interesting character because he originally only had one head and 2 arms. But then he became so overwhelmed with trying to himself take on all the sufferings of the world in the way I was describing before, that he actually, I mean, this is a myth, he actually broke into 1,000 pieces. And it said that his teacher, the Buddha Amitabha, put him back together with many arms and many heads so he could be of better service to the world. So that's a very beautiful myth for the Sangha, because there are lots of us with our heads, different heads and different arms. Each one of his arms is holding something different, so different things to help solve the problems of the world, to reach out to the world. And all of his heads are looking in different directions. You don't need to find it, it's fine, the moment's passed. Thanks, guys. Yeah, and his central pair of arms hold a jewel called the Chintamani, the wish-fulfilling jewel. So what is at the heart of Avalokiteshvara is his wish for all beings to be liberated. So Bhante suggested that we think of ourselves, each of us, as an arm of Avalokiteshvara, just one arm. Don't have to be all arms, just one arm. And just like all of his different arms, we don't have to have all the skills and all the answers and all the qualities. We just have to have our own special qualities, our own special skills that we all have. And we can offer them up to the body of Avalokiteshvara, to the body of the Sangha. And thereby we can participate in the arising of the cosmic bodhicitta. We can be part of a force of something which makes a huge impact on the world, and the Sangha really does make a huge impact on the world. We should not underestimate the effect that we have. And the Sangha does not exist separate from you. You are the Sangha. There's not some Sangha over there. We are creating Sangha tonight on Zoom in Great Hall, all the people who are on Zoom and in the Great Hall. So each of us in our own way, we can do what we can, but united, what brings us together is the common aspiration for the benefit of all people, the Chintamani, so that aspiration that we hold collectively and individually. So we don't have to be overwhelmed, because we're not just one person that has to solve everything. We're just part of one larger body, part of one person contributing to something greater, something bigger. We don't have to do it all. Nor do we have to go on a big ego trip, because it's not about us, actually. We're just part of something which is much bigger than us, a greater force acting in the world. We do our part, that's important, but we're just part of something bigger. So if we're inspired by this Bodhisattva ideal, if we want to become trainee bodhisattvas, we can be reassured that we don't have to, don't take it literally. We don't have to be a martyr, we don't have to be a spiritual social worker or a spiritual superhero, and we don't have to get overwhelmed. So we can all relax. All we have to do is just practice the best that we can. We just have to become the best arm of Avalokiteshvara that we can, become ourselves more and more. It's the most beautiful, skillful version of ourselves that we can. And cultivate in our heart that deep wish, that deep desire to be of service and benefit to all beings. So some useful questions for the trainee bodhisattva. Are there certain situations in which I tend to prioritise myself over other people? So sometimes there are certain situations I know where I'm a bit more selfish than other ones. It's worth thinking about what's going on there. And if so, are there ways that I can deepen my practice of ethics and metta so I can continue to loosen this, because that's what will help us. And we can reflect, what sort of arm am I? You know, what are my skills and qualities? And how can I more effectively offer them up to the cosmic bodhisattva? How can I give them to the Sangha? How can I be of more benefit? So to finish, I'd like to recite the transference of merits from the Sevenfold Poojas. So this is where we get to at the end of the Sevenfold Puja, a very beautiful set of the verses evoking the Buddhas, and I won't go through the Sevenfold Puja, but anyway, by the time we get to the end, we've got lots of merits, and we give it all away. And I think this beautifully sums up the spirit of the Bodhisattva. So I'm going to recite the transference of merits, to transfer my merits. And I'd like to invite everybody else to also do that, everybody who knows it. In unison, I don't know if you're allowed to speak while I'm standing here quietly, so in here you can say it very quietly. At home you could shout it from the rooftops. So, may the merit gained in my acting thus go to the alleviation of the suffering of all beings. my personality throughout my existences, my possessions, and my merit in all three ways. I give up without regard to myself for the benefit of all beings. Just as the earth and other elements are serviceable in many ways to the infinite number of beings inhabiting limitless space, so may I become that which maintains all beings, situated throughout space, so long as all have not attained to peace.